So picture this, right? It's 1814.
Okay.
And there's this British aristocrat, and she's looking out over her just massive inherited estates up in the Scottish Highlands.
Right. Huge tracts of land.
Huge. And she makes this really simple kind of cold economic calculation. She decides that keeping something like 15,000 human beings living on her land is just, well, it's way less profitable than grazing sheep.
Yeah, sheep are the real money makers there.
Exactly. So over the next few years, she doesn't just, raise the rent, she sends in the military.
Wow.
Yeah, literally the military. Villages get systematically burned to the ground. Homes that had been standing there for generations are just totally demolished.
Wiped off the map.
Wiped out. There's this one instance that is just horrifying where an elderly woman actually refused to leave her cottage and she was burned to death inside it.
Oh, that is horrific.
Right. And the survivors, these thousands of people, are driven out to these completely barren coastlines. They're forced into utter destitution, while the land they had lived on for, centuries gets handed over to 130,000 sheep.
It's a staggering image of devastation, really. And the thing is, it forces us to confront this historical reality that is just, it's almost entirely absent from our modern economic textbooks.
Yeah, you don't hear about the burning cottages in Econ 101.
No, you really don't. We are so accustomed to this very different, very sanitized narrative about how the economic world we live in actually came to be.
Well, welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today, we are basically taking a sledgehammer to that fairy tale. The idea that capitalism just began with a polite piggy bank and a really strong work ethic.
Yeah, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps origin story.
Exactly. Our mission today is to unpack this foundational, historically explosive concept that's known as primitive accumulation. We're exploring the really violent genesis of the modern capitalist system, and we're going to do this by looking directly through the analytical lens of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels.
And we have a pretty massive stack of original source material to get through today with you all.
We really do.
We're pulling heavily from Marx's his monumental work, Capital, specifically focusing on the chapters where he details this primitive accumulation. But we're also layering in some incredibly vivid, highly detailed journalistic dispatches that he wrote.
Right, for the New York Daily Tribune, right, in the 1850s.
Exactly, the Tribune dispatches, plus a few of his private letters.
Yeah.
And the goal here is to really look at the historical architecture of their argument.
To see the receipts, basically.
Right, to understand not just, the events that happened during the transition from the feudal world, but the underlying mechanisms of how those specific events forged the very DNA of modern private property.
Now, before we go any further, I do need to make a really clear impartiality disclaimer to you, the listener, because the sources we're unpacking today, they contain some highly charged political, historical, and economic theory.
Very charged.
Yeah, extremely. So, as your guides on this deep dive, we are not taking sides, we are not endorsing these viewpoints, and we aren't advocating for any particular political ideology.
Right. That's not what we do here.
Exactly. Our goal is strictly and impartially to report and unpack the ideas, the arguments, and the historical events exactly as they are presented in this original source material. We're just looking at what the text says.
Our role is basically just to examine the mechanics of the arguments that Marx and Engels present. Right. We're looking at the historical evidence they marshal to support those arguments, and we want to help clarify some of the honestly incredibly dense economic concepts they use.
Yeah, the writing can be pretty sick sometimes.
It really can.
Yeah.
But it's necessary to describe this massive transformation of human society.
So, holding to that standard of impartiality, let's just jump right into the origins of wealth. Because the prevailing story, the one that forms the bedrock of classical economics, and honestly, the story that we still implicitly teach today, is this story of peaceful accumulation.
The whole previous accumulation theory.
Right. It's the idea that a long time ago, some people simply just worked harder than others.
Yeah, and to understand the sheer force of Marx's critique in the text, you really have to understand the narrative that he was attacking. The classical political economists who came before him, figures like Adam Smith.
The invisible hand guy.
Exactly, Adam Smith. They operated on this assumption of what they called previous accumulation. They basically posited this sort of historical state of nature. And in this scenario, society was divided into two distinct groups.
Okay, who are the groups?
Well, on one side, you had the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite.
Right, the people who saved their pennies, built their little tools, and, planned for the future.
Precisely. And on the other side, classical theory posited this massive majority of basically Lazy rascals.
Lazy rascals.
Yeah, people who just squandered their substance in riotous living. People who consumed absolutely everything they produced immediately without a single thought for tomorrow.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because it really sounds just like a fairy tale. It's like the fable of the ant and the grasshopper, but it's been elevated to the status of macroeconomic theory.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Right, like the diligent little ants save all their wealth, eventually acquiring enough capital like land, tools, money to become the employers, and the grasshoppers just squander everything until they have absolutely nothing left to sell except their own physical labor.
Right, and in that classical framing, it's a completely bloodless, highly moral process.
It's just fair play.
Exactly. The current class division is presented as just the natural, mathematically inevitable consequence of basic human behavior.
But I'm guessing Marx wasn't a big fan of the ant and grasshopper story.
Oh, Marx views this narrative with absolute contempt.
Contempt?
Yeah, he actually refers to it in the text as insipid childishness.
Ouch.
Yeah, he pulls no punches. He argues that this peaceful, moralistic origin story is preached every day by the defenders of the current economic order simply to legitimize the status quo.
So it's basically PR.
It's a comforting fiction. It's designed to make the current arrangement of society, with all its extreme disparities of wealth, seem not only just but eternal.
Because, I mean, if wealth is just the result of hard work and thrift, then poverty is just the natural result of laziness. It completely removes any need to look at structural violence.
Exactly.
But the sources we're looking at today argue that in actual history, the squirrel didn't just quietly save its nuts for the winter. What Marx is saying is that the squirrel actually hired armed mercenaries, drove the grasshopper entirely out of the forest, burned down the grasshopper's habitat, and then told the starving grasshopper that the only way to get a meal was to work in the squirrel's new, nut processing facility.
That analogy captures the essence of his critique perfectly. Marx argues that the actual historical record is one where conquest, enslavement, robbery, and murder, basically sheer force, play the great part.
Sheer force.
Yes. He insists that primitive accumulation is not the tranquil result of the capitalist mode of production, as the classical economists implied, but its violently enforced starting point.
It's like the Big Bang of the whole capitalist system.
That's exactly what it is.
So if we strip away the fable, how does the text actually define primitive accumulation? Like mechanically, what is the actual lever being pulled here?
Well, the core mechanical definition of primitive accumulation is the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production.
Okay, divorcing the producer from the means of production.
Right. You have to take the people who actually do the work, the peasants, the agricultural laborers, the self-sufficient artisans.
The people getting their hands dirty.
Yes, and you have to forcibly separate them from the land, the raw materials, and the tools that they actually need to feed and clothe themselves.
And he says this wasn't a peaceful negotiation.
Not at all. Marx writes that the history of this expropriation is written in the annals of mankind in, quote, letters of blood and fire.
Letters of blood and fire. I mean, that phrase alone really signals a massive departure from spreadsheets and supply and demand curves. We are talking about human trauma on an intergenerational scale here.
We are. And this trauma, according to the text, was an absolute structural necessity. Capitalism just cannot function without a very specific, artificially created polarization of the market.
What do you mean by polarization?
You need two fundamentally different kinds of commodity possessors to meet in the marketplace and strike a bargain. On one side, you need the owners of money, machinery, and the means of subsistence.
The capitalists.
Right, the people eager to increase their accumulated wealth by buying the labor power of others.
Okay, and on the other side of that transaction, you obviously need people who are willing to sell their labor. Which actually leads to one of the most fascinating and frankly kind of unsettling paradoxes in the entire text. Marx talks about the creation of the, quote, free laborer, and he uses that word free with this really profound, almost acidic irony.
Ah, yes, the double sense of freedom. This is such a crucial concept in Capital. When we hear the word freedom today, we almost universally code it as a positive thing, right?
Oh, for sure. Liberty, human rights, self-determination, freedom is good.
Right. But in the context of primitive accumulation, this freedom has two faces. First, the worker must be free in the legal sense. They must be free from being a slave, a serf, or a bondsman.
Okay.
They must own their own person, capable of entering into a voluntary contract. They're no longer legally bound to a feudal lord or tied to a specific estate.
And that's the face of freedom we usually celebrate. Like, you aren't someone else's property anymore. You are your own person.
Yes. But the second face of freedom is where the trap kind of snaps shut.
Oh, boy.
The second sense of freedom is that the worker must be completely free, meaning entirely stripped, completely unencumbered of any property, any land, or any means of production of their own.
Wow.
They must be completely free of the ability to survive independently.
So let me make sure I've got this. If I'm a peasant living under feudalism, I might be a serf. I owe part of my crop to the Lord. I have to work his fields. I'm bound by these really brutal obligations. I am definitely not legally free.
Definitely enough.
But crucially, I have access to the communal land. I have a little cottage. I have a patch of dirt where I can grow some cabbages. And I have access to the forest to gather firewood.
Right, you have customary rights.
So I have the actual physical means to sustain my own biological life. Even if the Lord is taking a cut, I can feed myself.
Yes, the feudal serf was heavily exploited, no question. But they were not structurally dependent on a monetary wage for their bare biological survival.
But then primitive accumulation happens.
Right. The process of primitive accumulation shattered that old arrangement. By violently evicting the peasant from the land, they granted them legal freedom, sure, but simultaneously severed their access to the means of life.
It's like your freedom becomes a biological weapon that's just used against you. You are completely free to go wherever you want, but you are also completely free from having food or shelter.
Exactly.
Therefore, the only way to avoid starvation is to go and sell your labor to the person who now owns the land and the tools. So you aren't being forced to work by a man standing there with a whip. You're being forced by the empty space in your own stomach.
That's the exact dynamic. I really want to encourage everyone listening to just sit with that concept for a moment. Consider what it means to be truly free in a market economy if you completely lack the independent means to sustain yourself.
It changes the whole meaning of a voluntary contract.
It does. The classical economists pointed to the voluntary labor contract as proof of a fair, free system. But Marx is arguing that a contract signed under the threat of imminent starvation is inherently coercive.
Yeah, it's an offer you literally can't refuse.
Right. But to create a society where millions of people live under that constant simmering threat of starvation, you first had to violently sever them from the earth.
Which brings us out of the realm of abstract economic theory and right back into those devastating historical case studies provided in our sources. Because how exactly were millions of people just severed from their ancestral lands?
It's a massive logistical and violent undertaking.
Let's look really closely at the Scottish Highlands, which Marx uses as kind of ground zero for understanding this process in its most distilled, brutal form.
The Scottish clearances they're a tragedy that just perfectly illustrates the mechanics of primitive accumulation.
Right.
But to really comprehend the magnitude of the shock to these people, we have to look at how Highland society was structured before the clearances even began.
Because it wasn't just typical landlords and renters, right?
Exactly. It was not a system of landlords and renters in the modern capitalist sense at all. It was organized entirely around the clan system.
And a clan, fundamentally, is a kinship group. It's a massive extended family organized in a sort of military manner.
Right. The clan was governed by ancient traditions, customary rights, and very deep blood ties. The land itself did not belong to the clan chief as his personal private real estate.
The concept of private real estate just wasn't really a thing for them in that way.
Exactly. That concept didn't exist in their world. The land belonged to the clan as a collective entity. The chief was the patriarchal head, the leader in battle, the main distributor of resources.
But he didn't hold the deed.
No. And the rank-and-file clansmen had this ancient, customary right to live on and work the land of their ancestors.
So how does a system that is built on hundreds of years of blood ties and communal land ownership suddenly dissolve into a system where a single aristocrat can basically evict thousands of their own relatives?
The catalyst that's mentioned in the sources is highly political, specifically the aftermath of the 1745 Jacobite uprising.
Right, Bonnie Prince Charlie and all that.
Exactly. The Highland clans had backed the wrong side, militarily speaking. They supported the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. And after they were decisively defeated at the Battle of Culloden, the British state actively and aggressively set out to crush the military power and the cultural independence of the Highland clans.
They really went after their whole identity. I mean, they banned the wearing of the tartan, they banned the bearing of arms, they essentially outlawed the Gaelic way of life entirely.
They did.
Yeah.
But the economic transformation was even more profound than the cultural suppression.
How so?
Well, the British state drew the clan chiefs, these great men, into the political and social orbit of London. And surviving in the high society of the London court required vast amounts of cash.
Right, you can't pay for a London townhouse with a cart full of barley.
Exactly. The traditional clan system, which operated largely on payments in kind oats, barley, military service, it just did not produce the liquid capital these chiefs now needed to maintain their status among the English aristocracy.
So the chiefs look at their ancestral lands and they look at their own kin living on those lands and they realize they need to monetize them. They have to somehow transform a military kinship structure into a capitalist real estate venture.
And they achieved this through a process of what you could call legal alchemy. Ancient tributes and customary obligations were systematically replaced by fixed money contracts.
Just wiping away centuries of tradition with a pen.
Right. The chiefs used their newly integrated political power within the British state to usurp the clan's communal land, legally reclassifying it as their own absolute private property. The customary usufruct, the right of the people to actually use the land, was totally erased by paper deeds held in London.
That legal erasure really sets the stage for the horrors that are detailed in Marx's journalism. And I want to spend some time on those dispatches he wrote for the New York Daily Tribune, because the specifics are just chilling. He focuses really intently on the actions of the Countess of Sutherland, who later became the Duchess of Sutherland.
Yes, she is presented in the text as the primary architect of a massive, ruthless, and highly calculated economic reform in the northernmost part of Scotland.
The scale of her holdings is genuinely difficult to wrap your head around. The sources note that she inherited vast estates in Sutherlandshire, an area that Marx notes is larger than many French departments or even small German principalities.
It's massive.
We were talking about nearly 800,000 acres, and living on this vast tract of land were about 15,000 Gaels, comprising roughly 3,000 families. These were people whose ancestors had inhabited those exact valleys since time immemorial.
And the Countess, heavily influenced by modern economic theories of maximizing profit, Marx actually notes that she had, quote, well digested her Malthus. She determined that the current arrangement was hopelessly inefficient.
She wanted a better return on investment.
Exactly. The most profitable use of that vast, rugged landscape was not to have 15,000 human beings scraping a subsistence living from it. The global market, particularly the burgeoning textile mills down in England, they hungered for wool. So the most profitable use of the land was sheep.
But you can't just drop thousands of sheep onto land that is already occupied by thousands of subsistence farmers. The people are in the way.
Right, they are an obstacle.
So between 1814 and 1820, she initiated a systematic military-style campaign to just exterminate the traditional way of life and expel those 15,000 people.
And the eviction process was not a matter of, sending a polite legal notice and waiting for a court date. The details provided in the text are visceral and violently physical.
They were burning them out.
Villages were completely demolished and subsequently set on fire to ensure the inhabitants absolutely could not return. Every acre of agricultural field, every patch of cultivated land that had sustained human life for centuries was forcibly converted into pasturage for sheep.
British soldiers were actually deployed to enforce the evictions. They literally came to blows with the native Highlanders who tried to defend their homes. I mentioned it in the intro, but the image of that elderly woman burned alive in her hut because she refused to leave. I mean, it shatters any illusion that the transition to capitalism was a peaceful, voluntary negotiation. This was a literal war against the peasantry.
It was. And the mathematics of this operation really reveal the utter ruthlessness of the economic logic at play. Over the course of just a few years, the Duchess appropriated 794,000 acres of clan land.
Unbelievable.
By 1821, those 15,000 human beings had been completely removed from the interior valleys, and they were replaced by 131,000 sheep.
Okay, so the obvious question is, where did the 15,000 people go? They were suddenly landless refugees in their own country.
Well, the Duchess, in a move the sources describe with just biting sarcasm as the exuberance of her generosity, relocated the expelled natives to the extreme edges of her property.
To the coast.
Yes, she allotted them roughly 6,000 acres of land along the seacoast.
If you do the math on that, 15,000 people, maybe 3,000 families, on 6,000 acres, that's about 2 acres per family.
Right.
You cannot sustain a family on 2 acres of land, even if it's really good land.
And it was emphatically not good land. The text explicitly states that this coastal strip had been lying entirely waste until that point. It brought in absolutely no revenue to the proprietors because it was essentially barren rock and shoreline. It was completely unfit for traditional agriculture.
So she gives them useless rocks.
Yes, and to compound the injury, she didn't give this wasteland to them as compensation. She actually charged them rent.
Wait, really? She charged them rent for the barren rock?
Yes, she charged them an average of 2 shillings and 6 pence per acre for barren wasteland to the very clansmen who had for centuries shed their blood fighting for her family's honor and security.
The betrayal is just absolute.
It is. Stripped of their arable land, the Highlanders were forced into an entirely new mode of existence. An English author that Marx quotes actually described them as becoming amphibious.
Amphibious.
They lived half on land, half on water. They were forced to try and survive by fishing or by gathering kelp along the shore to be processed into alkali for the glass and soap industries. They were entirely severed from their traditional means of subsistence, totally transformed into a precarious, desperate labor force.
And this leads to one of the most blistering journalistic takedowns I've ever read in my life. Years after these clearances, the Sutherland family, the inheritors of this blood-soaked wealth, they hosted this magnificent, highly publicized gala down in London, and the guest of honor was Harriet Beecher Stowe.
The famous American author who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Right. And the stated purpose of this lavish party was for the British aristocracy to publicly demonstrate their deep, philanthropic sympathy for the enslaved black people in the American South.
Marx writes about this with just staggering sarcasm. He points out the grotesque hypocrisy of these people weeping over American slavery while completely ignoring their own role in enforcing what he terms British wages slavery.
It's just wild. The Duchess is shedding these very public tears for enslaved people across the Atlantic while willfully, actively ignoring the brutal atrocities, the burning huts, and the mass expulsions that her own family engineered just to generate the wealth that was paying for the gala.
Exactly. Marx concludes that an enemy of wage slavery has every right to condemn Negro slavery, but a Duchess of Sutherland, never.
Never.
It is a really powerful rhetorical strategy by Marx. He is dragging the violence of primitive accumulation out from under the rug. He's showing how the beneficiaries of this violence prefer to view themselves as civilized, cultured, and philanthropic, relying on a willful amnesia about the actual origins of their own capital.
Yeah, they just conveniently forget the burning villages.
Right. And the Sutherlands were by no means an isolated case. The sources provide a whole litany of aristocratic brutality across the Highlands.
Like the Duke of Athol. I mean, the Duchess of Sutherland replaced humans with sheep because it was economically rational, right? Wool paid better than rent from peasants. But the Duke of Athol decided he didn't even need the economic justification.
Right. He took it a step further.
Having watched humans be superseded by sheep, he decided to supersede the sheep with game. He drove out both humans and sheep to turn vast tracts of the Highlands into what were called deer forests.
And as the text points out, these forests often had absolutely no trees.
Just naked mountains.
They were simply naked mountains and valleys, entirely cleared of human habitation and agricultural use, solely so the Duke and his aristocratic friends could hunt deer for sport during the autumn season.
He literally prioritized his leisure and his hunting grounds over the existence of entire communities of people.
He did. And then there is the dispatch regarding Mrs. MacDonald of Knoydart, which, honestly, it reads like something out of a dystopian novel. She decided to clear her estates to make way for sheep. Some of her cottagers had fallen into arrears on their rent, which is hardly surprising given the economic conditions, so she ordered them all off the land immediately.
They were driven from their homes and forced to take refuge in the surrounding woods and caves, right?
Yes. The dispatch of the Tribune notes they were lurking, or rather dying, in these natural shelters, totally exposed to the harsh Scottish elements, while Mrs. MacDonald's horses were kept warmly bedded in secure, comfortable stables.
And didn't she offer to send them to Canada or something?
She magnanimously offered them free passage to Canada, yes, mainly because the source Riley notes that paying for their passage across the ocean was actually cheaper than paying the local poor rates to keep them from starving in Scotland. But she informed them that they were free to sell their little stocks before they departed.
Which is just a statement of profound cruelty, given that they had absolutely no stock left to sell.
None at all. The text records that they possessed nothing but the ragged clothes on their backs, maybe a broken table, or, in one heartbreakingly specific detail, a rheumatic cat.
A rheumatic cat. You are evicted from the only home you've ever known. Your landlord's horses are living in luxury while you literally freeze in a cave, and the entirety of your worldly possessions is a sick cat.
It's devastating. And then Mrs. McDonald publicly announced that she had forgiven them the rent arrears that they couldn't possibly pay anyway, which the local press actually lauded as an act of noble generosity.
Unbelievable.
Now, when we step back from these specific, localized horrors in Scotland, we begin to see the broader structural argument Marx is making about Europe as a whole. Millions of people over several centuries were subjected to variations of this exact process. They were violently torn from their traditional means of survival, stripped of their customary rights to the land, and just cast adrift.
Which opens up a massive logistical problem for this newly forming capitalist society. Because if you violently push millions of people off their land, where do they go? They don't just magically teleport into a textile mill and cheerfully ask for a time card.
Exactly. They are rural peasants. They have absolutely no concept of wage labor, factory discipline, or urban living. They are hurled into a terrifying new reality they do not understand.
So what happens to them?
Well, they were violently displaced. And the nascent manufacturing sector in the towns and cities, which was still in its very infancy, it couldn't possibly absorb this massive influx of desperate humanity fast enough. So, predictably, this displaced population turned to the only avenues left to them to survive.
They became wanderers. The sources detail how Europe was suddenly flooded with this massive population of the displaced, turning en masse to beggary, vagabondage, and robbery simply to acquire their next meal.
Right.
And how did the state respond to this crisis? A crisis, I might add, that the property-owning class had entirely manufactured themselves.
The state definitely did not respond with social safety nets or relief programs. It responded with what the text chillingly refers to as bloody discipline. The state stepped in to solve the logistical problem of this displaced population through sheer, unadulterated terror.
We're looking at the laws passed in England during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries under monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. And the brutality of the legislation is genuinely difficult to stomach. The sources note that people found wandering without employment were subjected to grotesque punishments. They were tied to the backs of carts and whipped until their bodies literally ran with blood.
Whipped through the streets.
Yeah, and they were branded with red-hot irons on their chests or foreheads with the letter V for vagabond.
And it gets worse. If they were caught a second time, they could actually have half their ears sliced off. And if they were caught a third time wandering without a master, they were legally classified as obstinate enemies of the state, and they were executed.
Executed just for being homeless.
Yes. During the reign of Henry VIII alone, tens of thousands of people were executed under these vagrancy laws.
They were essentially criminalizing the state of being unemployed right after having systematically destroyed the only employment these people had ever known. The state was literally trying to whip, brand, and torture these displaced peasants into accepting the discipline necessary for the new wage system.
Exactly.
Now, this raises a massive philosophical contradiction that I really want to explore here, because modern economic theory often preaches the gospel of the free market, right? The narrative is that capitalism is the natural result of individuals freely trading with one another, and that the state should interfere as little as possible.
The laissez-faire ideal.
Yeah, but the text seems to be arguing the exact opposite of that. It suggests that capitalism could never have grown naturally out of voluntary contracts. It required the heavy, incredibly violent, and hyperactive hand of the state to literally torture people into factories.
You have hit on a central pillar of Marx's critique of liberal economics right there. The idea of the state as this neutral referee that simply enforces contracts and just stays out of the market, Marx argues that is a much later ideological invention.
So the state was very much involved.
Oh, intimately. Marx argues that the bourgeoisie, during its historical infancy as a class, absolutely relied on and actively commandeered the coercive power of the state.
The state wasn't a neutral arbiter. It was the armed enforcer building the architecture of the system.
Exactly. The early capitalists used state violence not just to punish vagabonds, but to artificially regulate wages, to force the lengthening of the working day, and to keep the newly minted laborer in a state of total dependence.
So when did they stop needing to whip people?
Well, it's only much later, once the capitalist system is fully established, structurally mature, and kind of humming along on its own momentum, that the dull compulsion of economic relations is sufficient to keep workers in line.
Ah, right. Because once the system is the only reality anyone knows, you don't need a literal whip anymore. The quiet, ever-present threat of starvation is whip enough. You don't need to brand someone if they know that missing a shift means they can't pay rent.
Exactly. The structural violence replaces the physical violence. But at the very beginning, you needed physical state force to break the centuries-old habits of the peasantry and force them into the mold of the wage laborer.
And that physical force severed them from the land. But Marx makes a brilliant, entirely counterintuitive economic deduction here that we really have to address. Driving the peasant off the land didn't merely create a massive pool of desperate workers. Simultaneously, in the exact same motion, it created a massive pool of captive consumers.
Yes, this is where we need to talk about the creation of the home market. It's a piece of the puzzle I had never really considered before looking at this.
Let's think about the peasant family before they were evicted, right? When they still had their little plot of land.
In Marx's terms, that peasant family primarily produced use values. A use value is something you create directly for its usefulness, to consume it yourself, rather than creating it to sell in a market.
So, like, they grow their own grain to bake their own bread. They raise a few sheep, shear the wool, and spin it into clothing for their own children. They might trade a little surplus at a local market, but fundamentally, they're self-sufficient for their basic biological needs. They don't buy much because they make what they need.
Precisely. They exist largely outside the cash economy. But once that family is expropriated, once their cottage is burned, their land seized, and they are cast adrift and forced to move to a city to work for a wage, their entire relationship to consumption changes practically overnight.
Because they can't grow grain in a tenement slum. They can't spin wool in an alleyway.
Exactly. The flax they used to grow and spin themselves is now grown by a large capitalist agricultural enterprise, which then sells it to a large capitalist textile factory. And the evicted peasant, now working 14 hours a day in that very factory for a monetary wage, must take that wage and actually buy the clothing made from that flax.
They have to buy back their own survival.
They must buy the bread baked from the grain they used to grow themselves.
It's so brilliant in a dark way. The destruction of rural domestic industry was an absolute requirement for the system to scale. By destroying the peasants' ability to make their own things, the capitalists artificially generated the massive internal market their new factories needed to survive.
You cannot have mass production without mass consumption.
Right. Primitive accumulation didn't just force the masses into the factories to work. It forced them into the marketplace to buy back the very means of survival they used to produce for themselves.
It fundamentally transformed the raw materials and the means of subsistence into elements of capital. The food and clothing didn't disappear, they were just commodified. And this complete rewiring of daily life brings us to the psychological and experiential shift in the nature of labor itself.
Yeah, because the physical removal from the land is really only half the story here. Once these millions of people are forced into the factories, the very definition of what it means to work, what it means to create, undergoes this radical, traumatizing transformation.
To explain this internal transformation of work, the sources delve into a crucial distinction Marx makes between two stages of capitalist development. He calls them the formal subsumption of labor and the real subsumption of labor.
Okay, let's break those terms down without getting lost in the academic weeds, because it can get a little dense. Let's say, if I'm an independent artisan, let's say a shoemaker living in a small town.
Okay, shoemaker.
I own my all, I buy my own leather, I make a pair of shoes, and I sell them directly to my neighbor. I am entirely in control of my work. What happens when capital formally subsumes my labor?
Under the formal subsumption of labor, the actual physical technological process of making the shoe does not immediately change. You sit at the exact same bench, you use the exact same awl, you employ the exact same skills you spent years mastering. What fundamentally changes is the social and economic relationship.
Okay, so a wealthy merchant steps in. He realizes there is this massive new market of displaced peasants who need shoes. So he buys up all the leather in town, and he comes to me and says, "You no longer work for yourself. I will provide the leather, I will own the shoes you make, and I will pay you a daily wage to just sit there and make them."
Exactly. Capital has formally subsumed your labor process under its command. The capitalist now directs your labor time. But he hasn't yet revolutionized how the work is actually done.
Right.
However, Marx argues that formal subsumption is inherently unstable. It inevitably, inexorably drives toward real subsumption.
Because the capitalist is in competition with other capitalists, right? He needs to make more shoes faster and cheaper than the guy in the next town over. He needs to extract more what Marx calls surplus value, which is the extra unpaid labor he gets out of you after he's paid your basic survival wage.
Yes. And to extract more surplus value, the capitalist must change the nature of the work itself. He introduces the division of labor. Instead of one artisan making a whole shoe from start to finish, he hires 10 unskilled workers, often those displaced peasants we were talking about, to each perform one highly repetitive task.
So one cuts the leather, one punches the holes, one hammers the nails.
Exactly. And crucially, he introduces machinery.
And this is the real subsumption.
Yes, the work itself is fundamentally transformed, and this changes the worker's entire relationship to the tools they use. When you were a shoemaker, the awl was an extension of your hand. You guided the tool.
But under real subsumption, in the fully developed factory system, the dynamic flips entirely. The tool becomes a massive, steam-powered machine, and the worker no longer guides the machine. The worker becomes a mere conscious appendage to the machine.
Right, the relentless mechanical rhythm of machine dictates the physical movements, the pace, and the very bodily existence of the human being attached to it.
This transition brings us to Marx's famous concept of alienation, and it's a concept that feels incredibly relevant even today. Let's try to ground this. Imagine you are baking a beautiful, complex cake in your own kitchen for your daughter's birthday.
Okay, baking a cake.
You choose the ingredients, you mix the batter, you watch it rise in the oven, you decorate it with care. When you place that cake on the table, you feel a profound sense of pride, right? That cake is a physical manifestation of your time, your skill, and your love. You see the process from conception to consumption.
In that scenario, your labor is a direct expression of your humanity, and the product of your labor affirms your connection to others.
Right. Now, transplant that exact same physical energy into a factory operating under real subsumption. You are standing on an assembly line. Your only job for 14 hours a day is to hold a nozzle and squirt a single blue rosette of icing onto a cake as it speeds past you on a conveyor belt.
It's over and over again.
You do this 10,000 times a shift. You don't own the icing, you don't own the conveyor belt, and you certainly don't own the cakes. You will never eat them. They belong entirely to the factory owner who sells them to accumulate profit.
In that environment, the cake becomes an alien object to you. It is entirely severed from your sense of self. Marx argues that in capitalist production, the conditions of labor, the raw materials, the machinery, the factory itself, they confront the worker as independent alien forces.
It's like you're fighting against the very thing you're making.
Yes. The worker pours their life force, their finite physical and mental energy, into creating wealth. But that wealth does not belong to them. It belongs to the capitalist.
And because that wealth belongs to the capitalist, it is used to buy more machines, build bigger factories, and employ more workers. So the wealth the worker produces actively builds the very system that dominates them. The wealth becomes an alien power that rules over their life.
It is a closed, completely vicious loop of exploitation. As Marx writes, the worker produces the capitalist, and the capitalist produces the wage laborer. Each continually reproduces the other.
But the exchange is fundamentally asymmetrical.
Highly asymmetrical. The worker expends their own life force, leaving them physically depleted and spiritually impoverished, only to wake up the next morning and be in the drudgery anew just to secure the means to survive another day.
Yeah.
The very product of their own hands stands opposed to them as a hostile, dominating force.
The total power imbalance this creates, this reduction of the human being to basically a disposable input. It's illustrated with horrifying clarity in some of the other historical dispatches included in our sources. Because it wasn't just happening in the remote Scottish Highlands, right? It was happening everywhere capital was taking hold. Look at the evictions in Ireland mentioned in Marx's letters.
He references the actions of Lord Abercorn, who cleared his vast estates in Ireland by forcibly driving out thousands of people. And what makes this example particularly striking is that many of those evicted were not destitute peasants. They were relatively well-to-do tenant farmers.
Right. They had invested their own labor and their own money into improving the land. They had built better drainage systems, erected sturdy fences, improved the soil quality over generations.
But because they did not hold absolute legal title to the land, because the land was the private property of Lord Abercorn when they were evicted, all of those improvements, all of that accumulated capital and labor, were simply confiscated by the Lord without a single penny of compensation.
Their labor was legally stolen, just absorbed into the value of the estate.
Exactly. And then there is the dispatch concerning the English coal miners in Durham, which reads like the darkest chapter of a Dickens novel, except it was entirely real.
That one was tough to read.
Very. The miners, enduring just horrific conditions underground, finally went on strike for better wages and basic safety. The mine owner, Lord Londonderry, didn't view this as a typical labor dispute. He viewed it as an insurrection against its absolute property rights.
And because he owned not just the mine, but the entire town, the land, the houses, the local infrastructure, he possessed a terrifying arsenal of coercion. He decided to break the strike not through negotiation, but through exposure and starvation.
The details in the dispatch are agonizing.
Hmm.
In the dead of winter, during the most severe weather, Lord Londonderry dispatched his agents to evict the striking workers from their company-owned cottages.
Just threw them out in the snow.
The text specifically notes that they dragged a woman who was actively in the pangs of childbirth by her hair into the frozen street.
Just sickening.
They cast entire families, pregnant women, and small children into the freezing roadside ditches. He literally weaponized the element against them.
And when the desperate freezing workers tried to sneak back into their own empty cottages under the cover of darkness, just to sleep on the bare wooden floors out of the wind, Lord Londonderry actually escalated.
Yes.
He had his agents nail the doors shut and board over the windows to ensure the cottages remained empty and the workers remained out in the freezing cold. And he didn't stop there. He issued threats to all the local shopkeepers in the surrounding area, warning them of total financial ruin if they dared to extend even a crust of bread on credit to the striking miners.
It is a stark, undeniable demonstration of what it means when capital completely commands the conditions of labor and housing. The workers were subjected to the absolute dictatorial power of a single property owner.
And that owner was backed by the police and the military, who stood by ready to fire on the workers if they dared to violently resist their own freezing and starvation.
Exactly. And here is the ultimate crushing irony of alienation in that scenario. The workers' own labor had built those cottages. Their own labor, hacking at the coalface in the dark, had generated the immense wealth of Lord Londonderry. And that very wealth was now being used as a weapon to crush them into submission.
Wow. So we've traced the violent removal from the land, the draconian laws that forced people into the factories, and the alienating, dominating nature of the work itself, which brings us to a massive structural shift. This system didn't just transform human life, it fundamentally transformed the legal and philosophical definition of property itself.
Yes, the sources dedicate significant analysis to how the very nature of landed property mutated during this transition.
Under the old feudal system, an estate was intimately, inextricably tied to the lord's personal identity.
It had his name. He was the lord of somewhere. The land conferred political rank, jurisdiction, military obligation. It was a deeply personal, albeit deeply unequal, relationship. There was a sort of twisted paternalistic bond between the lord and the serfs who lived on his land. Exactly.
Yeah.
Land possessed what the text calls political and social embellishments. It was not a liquid asset. You didn't just sell it on a whim.
Right.
But under capitalism, land is stripped of all that feudal romance. It is transformed into just another commodity, no different than a ton of coal or a bale of cotton. It loses its personal political character entirely.
The landowner is completely separated from the land. The text makes the point that a modern capitalist landowner can live his entire life in a luxury villa in Constantinople, never once setting foot on his estate in Scotland, and merely collect the rent via bank transfer.
Marx refers to this as the huckstering of the earth. The earth itself is reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. Now, the sources note that many conservative romantic thinkers of the time wept sentimental tears over the loss of this old paternalistic feudal connection. They really mourned the loss of the noble landlord.
But Marx isn't shedding any tears for feudalism, is he?
Not a single one. Marx views this commodification of the earth as the perfectly rational, historically inevitable conclusion of private property. It strips away all the ideological illusions. It reveals the naked, transactional economic exploitation underneath. There are no more lords and vassals. There are only buyers and sellers.
And once everything, the land, the tools, the human life force, is completely commodified and thrown into the market, capitalism sets off on a very specific historical trajectory. This leads us to the grand, sweeping climax of Marx's argument in Capital, the dialectic of capitalist accumulation. Where is this massive, violent machine actually heading?
The central driving law of capitalist accumulation is centralization. The system is built on relentless competition. Capitalists must constantly innovate, expand, and undercut their rivals just to survive. And in this cutthroat competition, the larger, more efficient capitals inevitably destroy and absorb the smaller ones.
The big fish eat the little fish.
Yeah.
The massive factory drives the independent shoemaker out of business. Then the massive regional monopoly drives the massive factory out of business.
Exactly. As the famous, almost prophetic phrase in the text goes, one capitalist always kills many. So wealth and the means of production concentrate into fewer and fewer hands. But crucially, as this concentration occurs, capitalism inadvertently accomplishes something else. It socializes labor on a massive, unprecedented scale.
Wait, what does that mean practically to socialize labor? I thought this was all about private ownership.
It is about private ownership of the profits, but the labor becomes socialized. It means creating huge, complex, cooperative networks of workers. It means applying science and technology methodically to production. It means entangling all peoples, all nations, in the intricate net of the global market. Production is no longer an isolated artisan in a workshop. It is a globally coordinated effort involving millions of people.
So, by making production so incredibly efficient, so deeply interconnected, and yet concentrating the ownership of that massive network in the hands of a tiny oligarchy, is Marx arguing that capitalism is essentially building the very machinery that will eventually destroy it?
That is the very core of his historical vision. He argues that the monopoly of capital eventually becomes a fetter, a restriction, upon the very mode of production it created. The system becomes too vast, too deeply socialized, to be rationally managed by a handful of private owners seeking individual profit.
Ah, I see. The contradiction between how the stuff is made socialized production by millions of cooperating workers and how the wealth is distributed private appropriation by a few billionaires, it becomes this structural fault line that must eventually fracture.
And that leads to the famous revolutionary conclusion of the text. Marx writes, "The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated."
The expropriators are expropriated. It's a powerful reversal. Those who stole the land from the peasants, who built their empires through letters of blood and fire, finally have that wealth taken back by the organized masses who actually operate the machinery of the world.
Marx describes this historical pendulum swing using a philosophical concept called the negation of the negation.
Okay, let's unpack that because it sounds like dense academic jargon. What is a negation of a negation?
Think of it like a piece of wood. If you burn that wood, you destroy it, you negate it. It becomes ash. That is the first negation.
Okay, the wood is negated into ash.
But if you take that ash and mix it into the soil as fertilizer to grow a new, stronger tree, you have negated the ash. You have negated the negation. You haven't returned to the original piece of wood, but you have moved forward to a higher state using the remnants of the destruction.
I see. So applied to history. The first negation was capitalism violently destroying the independent, self-earned private property of the peasant and the artisan to build the factory system. It turned them into wage laborers.
Yes. And the second the negation of the negation is the collapse of the capitalist system itself. It is the destruction of capitalist private property.
Yeah.
But it does not mean returning to the isolated, struggling peasant farm.
We don't go backwards.
Right. It means returning to a form of individual property, but one based on the massive socialized acquisitions of the capitalist era. It means cooperative, common ownership of the globally integrated land and means of production.
It is a massive sweeping theory of history. It portrays a brutal, violent past leading inevitably to a revolutionized future. But there is a really vital caveat buried in our source material that kind of complicates this picture of mechanical inevitability. It's found in a series of letters Marx wrote toward the end of his life to a Russian socialist named Vera Zasulich.
This correspondence is fascinating because it reveals a flexibility in Marx's thinking that is often ignored by both his followers and his critics. Zasulich wrote to Marx with a profound dilemma regarding Russia.
Because Russia at this time was still overwhelmingly agrarian, right, full of peasants, barely touched by the Industrial Revolution.
And crucially, the Russian peasants still held their land in common through a traditional institution known as the rural commune, or the mir. Zasulich essentially asked Marx, according to your theory in Capital, does Russia have to go through the brutal, agonizing meat grinder of primitive accumulation? Do we have to intentionally destroy our traditional rural communes, force our peasants into cities, and build miserable capitalist factories just so we can eventually have a socialist revolution?
Because if you read Capital as a rigid, universal instruction manual for history, the answer would be yes. You must have capitalism to build the factories before you can have socialism to take them over. You have to suffer the blood and fire first.
Exactly. But Marx writes back and explicitly states that the historical inevitability of this violent expropriation that he detailed so meticulously in Capital was strictly limited to the countries of Western Europe.
Wow, that is a massive admission. He's saying his model isn't a universal straitjacket for every society on Earth.
He points out a structural difference. In Western Europe, the transition was from one form of private property, feudal, to another form of private property capitalist. But in Russia, the land was not privately owned by the peasants. It was held communally. Marx argued that if a revolution occurred in Russia at the opportune moment, before capitalism fully infiltrated and destroyed the countryside, they might not have to go through the horrors of primitive accumulation.
They could actually skip the capitalist phase.
He theorized they could potentially use the existing rural commune as a fulcrum for social regeneration. They could build modern, socialized cooperation directly on top of their ancient communal traditions, integrating modern technology without having to first subject their population to the vagrancy laws, the burning cottages, and the alienating factories of Western Europe.
It's a remarkable piece of analysis because it shows he was constantly evaluating new data. He recognized that history doesn't always have to repeat its bloodiest, most traumatic chapters if human beings can understand their circumstances and seize the moment.
It serves as a vital reminder that these historical analyses are not mechanical inevitabilities. They are powerful tendencies shaped by specific, local historical conditions and human agency.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's take a breath and synthesize what we've discovered in these sources. We started by confronting the fairy tale of capitalism, the comforting myth that our economic world was born out of peaceful, frugal savings and natural human diligence. But by diving into the historical record, into the letters of blood and fire, we explored a very different reality. We saw how the modern economic world was forged through the violent, systematic severing of humanity from the earth. We looked at the sheer horror of the Scottish clearances, where families were burned out of their ancestral homes and driven to barren rocks simply to make way for profitable sheep.
And we examined how the state did not stand by as a neutral observer, but actively deployed draconian violence whippings, brandings, and executions to force those displaced, desperate people into the discipline of the wage system, simultaneously creating a captive consumer market.
We unpacked the psychological devastation of this process, how the factory system fundamentally changes the nature of work, alienating us from our own labor and turning our own life force into an alien power that rules over us, as we saw with the freezing miners in Durham. And finally, we looked at the grand historical trajectory, how this system of property is driven by a logic of centralization that places it on a collision course with its own limits, potentially building the cooperative machinery that will one day replace it.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought I want to leave you, the listener, with today. We spent this entire hour immersed in the 18th and 19th centuries, looking at physical land and physical factories. Today, in our modern world, we no longer see British soldiers burning crofters' huts in the Highlands to clear land for sheep. The violence of accumulation is rarely that overt or physical in the global north anymore. But as we look around our current digital economy, as we see massive tech conglomerates consolidating vast digital spaces, buying up intellectual property, training artificial intelligence on the collective, unpaid creative output of humanity, and turning independent creators into precarious algorithmic gig workers, we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question.
What does primitive accumulation look like in the 21st century?
Are we currently living through a new kind of enclosure of the commons? Not an enclosure of physical land this time, but an enclosure of human data, of our attention, of our social connections, and our creativity? Are we being subtly severed from the means of our own digital production, forced to rent back our own culture for the platforms that enclosed it?
That is a haunting thought to end on. If the X-ray machine of classical economics was broken when we looked at the origins of physical capitalism, maybe we need a completely new kind of scanner to see the enclosures happening to our digital lives right now. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the origin stories of the world around you, look closely at the fairy tales we are told about wealth, and remember that the tidy evolutionary charts rarely tell the whole bloody truth.